For Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a great honor to rise tonight to speak on Bill C-11. And we've been around this issue a number of times, and I think it's really important in this age of post-truth, disinformation, falsehood, and conspiracy that we actually say in Parliament what it is that we're debating, what the issues actually are. One would think that this was a place where the precepts of truth were supposed to hold some kind of standard, but unfortunately they don't. So C-11 is fundamentally a bill about making sure that some of the most powerful corporations in the world, the web giants, actually pay a fair share of tax and level a playing field with Canadian broadcasters who are unable to compete given the huge advantages that have been taken and appropriated by some of the media giants that have emerged out of Silicon Valley. For example, you look at Netflix and how Disney have moved online, taking up a huge role of broadcast, which is fine. Industry changes. But they're not paying nearly the level of tax in Canada for services they provide in Canada, which puts other Canadian operations at a disadvantage, nor have they been willing to pay into the system that exists in Canada, that has existed for years and has created an ecosystem of arts and culture and identity, the Media Fund. So this is about leveling the playing field. Now, what this bill is not, is it's not spying on your grandmother's internet. It's not, as I've heard conservatives say, allowing the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau to block your YouTube views on how to fix your deck. This is not about censorship and shutting down so-called free expression. This is about making sure that extremely powerful corporations pay their share. So we're going to talk about that tonight. Now, some of this information certainly was allowed in the previous Bill C-10 because I'm sorry to say it, but the now Environment Minister, who was then the Heritage Minister, his inability to even explain what the bill was about created an absolute total dumpster fire and got people rightly upset because he couldn't explain the difference between corporate content, user-generated content. What was exactly in the bill, I don't think he seemed to know. It left the arts community, it left everyone else having to do damage control. Now, C-11, I would say it's an okay bill. It's not a great bill. But, as Madam Speaker, as a legislator, one of the great honors of my career has been to work with parliamentarians from around the world on the need that we have to address the unprecedented power of Silicon Valley and make them obligated to respect domestic jurisdiction. And their complete disregard for domestic jurisdiction is a serious issue. And I would say in 2018, when I was on the Ethics Committee and the Canadian delegation of parliamentarians went to London for the first International Grand Committee, I believed at that time that the Canadian delegation was out front because we were working together, Conservative, Liberal, New Democrats, because we understood the need to take on the disinformation and the threat to democracy was such a serious element that it was beyond partisanship. And what I've seen in my international meetings is that the need to hold companies like YouTube and Facebook to meet domestic obligations is something that should normally be beyond partisan consideration, but that's not what's happened under C-11. We met with parliamentarians from Brazil who told us about the shocking rise of Bolsonaro, who was a complete marginal extremist, but how he used the YouTube algorithms to drive his ascendancy, which has created a political toxic nightmare in Brazil. We met with representatives from the Global South who attempted time and time again to deal with Facebook and YouTube on toxic disinformation that led to genocidal levels of death in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, meeting with delegations from Singapore and their attempts to get these Silicon Valley companies to take responsibility for the hate that was being perpetrated. Because, Madam Speaker, you know, the member for Lethbridge, in one of the most dismal, disgraceful speeches I have ever heard in my 19 years today, presented a complete falsehood and talked about this magical thing called the internet. This isn't 2004. This is 2023, where this so-called magical thing called the internet in Myanmar had replaced all the domestic media and was used to promote violent, hateful genocide that left thousands and thousands and thousands of people dead. And we had the representative from Facebook come to our committee, and I asked him the simple question about the corporate responsibility for genocide. And the answer we got was that classic Silicon Valley jargon bunk. Well, nobody's perfect. We're all on a journey together. We're not on a journey together when corporate irresponsibility leads to genocide.
That's right.
And, Madam Speaker, this is not about my opinion. This was the United Nations begging Facebook to take responsibility because they were the only broadcaster. Same thing in Sri Lanka. Same thing in Germany, where you can track the rise of anti-refugee violence to the algorithms of Facebook and YouTube. And what we never heard from the Conservatives in their attack on C-11 is anything about the algorithms. So again, I want to refer to my colleague from Lethbridge and the toxic brew of paranoia and disinformation and hate that was promoted. That this was said that C-11, and I've read the legislation, was going to allow the cabinet, the Liberals, the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, to spy on your search page. That's a falsehood. To say that, again, C-11 would allow the Liberals, the cabinet, the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, to watch your Facebook scrolling. That's a deliberate falsehood. And that has nothing to do with how Facebook or YouTube work and the algorithms that drive people to extremism. She said that this bill would allow the cabinet, the Liberals, the elite gatekeepers, the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and she threw in also the big arts union bosses, she threw that in, to block your ability to watch cat videos. That was said in the House of Commons. And I raise that, Madam Speaker, because, you know, there's a lot of synthetic outrage that we hear. That's part of the job, and people jump up and down and declare all kinds of calumny towards the government. And I've certainly declared all kinds of malice towards government over the years. But we're in an age of disinformation and paranoia. And we're talking about the need for parliamentarians to rise above that and not feed it for mendacious political purposes. And this is an important issue because we see in 2023 the rise of conspiracy politics and how it's actually working in the new leader of the Conservative Party thinks it's working in his favor. So when the member for Lethbridge says that if this bill's passed, it will make the leader of Canada be powerful like a dictator of North Korea, not only is that a falsehood, it's a disgrace to anyone who suffers under authoritarian regimes, and it needs to be called out. Because we're at a point, Madam Speaker, where we're at 44% of the Canadian public is now believing conspiracy theories, and it's being fed by Conservatives who believe that this will get them somehow an advantage in polling, and I think it's a very, very dangerous path to go down. We have only to look, for example, at the new shadow minister for infrastructure, who's used her time in the House to promote disinformation that Bill Gates, a classic trope of conspiracy theorists, is using vaccines, which is another anti-conspiracy misinformation drive, that Bill Gates and vaccines are undermining Canadian sovereignty and accusing the Prime Minister. That's a person who was appointed as the shadow minister in a Conservative shadow cabinet. And so it's not surprising that when Christine Anderson, a far-right German neo-Nazi extremist, came to Canada, that she was feted and welcomed by key members of the Conservative caucus because they felt at home with that spread of disinformation.
Shame.
And this isn't harmless stuff, Madam Speaker. There was just a report that came out on vaccine disinformation that said in Canada, it pegged 198,000 extra cases of COVID, 13,000 more people sent to hospital, $300 million hit to the medical system from people who were encouraged to believe in vaccine disinformation. And an extra 2,800 people died as a result. That's double all the car accidents in Canada for a year.
Wow.
And these people weren't isolated weirdos. They were our cousins, our neighbors, our aunts. So when we see the Conservatives promoting vaccine disinformation because they think it's going to win them votes, we have to ask ourselves what's happening in our nation today, that the political representatives of the people are not telling people, no, listen, medical science is working with us. We didn't have all the answers on the vaccines. We didn't have all the answers on dealing with the biggest pandemic in a century. But we all had an obligation to stand up and say, threatening and attacking doctors and nurses and paramedics is unacceptable. But that is the danger of disinformation. And Madam Speaker, this pattern is not as though it's something comes out of nowhere. Because we know that what happened in Brazil with the Zika virus, there was suddenly a proliferation of falsehood videos on YouTube that told mothers that it was feminists who were making their children sick, that it was George Soros who was making their children sick, and that it was doctors and nurses who were on the front lines of trying to stop that pandemic. So we see how this disinformation, and why is that disinformation needing to be talked about? Because you've never heard this Conservative caucus ever talk about holding the algorithms to account. Because it's the algorithms that's created the toxic disinformation and is actually upending democratic engagement. Because, you know, Conservatives talk about freedom. You know, the freedom to believe in ivermectin and horse tranquilizers. We've heard Liberal or Conservative leadership candidates brag on about how great ivermectin is. Well, they can believe whatever they want. But the issue is, it's how the algorithms on Facebook and YouTube turn people towards disinformation. There's a fascinating, I urge my colleagues to read the book, The Chaos Machine. Because you'll see in that how when they started to study vaccine disinformation in 2013, 2014, that there were parent groups talking about raising your children, but the only ones that were promoted on the algorithm promoted disinformation. And if you clicked on one of those, soon after the algorithm would feed you towards more and more extremist content. And by the time the pandemic hit, and I was sitting, I joined an international group of parliamentarians led by Damien Collins from the UK when the pandemic hit, because we thought we could actually stay ahead of disinformation. We thought we could challenge it and take it on. And within a month, it was clear that game was over. And if you checked during the pandemic, and I urge my colleagues to read The Chaos Machine, that if you checked anything on Facebook asking you for the query alternate health in the Facebook function, it sent you to QAnon. That's how the algorithm works. The algorithms are set to send people to extremism. But you don't hear that when the Conservatives talk about C-11. They're trying to make Canadians believe that this is some kind of plot so that the big liberal elites and their gatekeepers and their big arts bosses can attack your rights and spy on you and shut down your views. The Conservatives, now I believe, in fairness, I know that some of the Conservatives believe this. I firmly believe that some of them, in their hearts, do believe in all this Klaus Schwab, George Soros, tin hat conspiracy theory. But I also know that there's an element in the Conservative Party who actually just thinks, what a great idea. Why don't we spread the hate and disinformation? Because it'll keep people angry and it'll get them to vote against the other government. They don't come here with a vision of how to address the mass power of the web giants that other jurisdictions are dealing with. They don't come here to say, how do we actually ensure a balance of rights and a balance of freedoms? And how do we ensure local content? And I am not going to be one to say, let's be giving extra money to Post Media or any of the other historic companies. But what is the obligation of companies to pay their share? That is a fair discussion. That's what we should be discussing. But that's not how this has been turned into, because it has been about the Conservative push to promote disinformation and falsehoods and ridiculous statements about that actually would make sense. The only thing I haven't heard from the Conservatives is Pizzagate. That's about the only thing they haven't mentioned. They mentioned everything else but. So when I go back to international forums with parliamentarians from France, from Germany, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Brazil, who are saying, what is Canada doing about disinformation? I'll say, well, you know, it's a mixed bag. We recognize the damage that disinformation is doing. We recognize that it costs lives. We recognize that it's creating paranoia. We recognize that there's been a rise of death threats against doctors and nurses and paramedics and people in political life for daring to speak up. I mean, it was the member for Oshawa who used his position in the House of Commons to promote this falsehood that the Prime Minister was somehow working for Klaus Schwab. And when I took that on, within an hour, I was attacked and received threats.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay. The Honourable Member for Lethbridge has a point of order.
Thank you. I recognize that the Honourable Member would like to go on and on and on and on, and he really enjoys the sound of his own voice, but he is so far off from the scope of this bill.
The Honourable Member has 20 minutes for his speech. Yeah, and he's been touching.
It is a point of order. This bill has nothing to do with dealing with disinformation. In fact, an amendment was brought forward, I believe, to deal with and that amendment was rejected. So I would just ask that the member get back on track.
A debate, and you know, the Honourable Member knows there's a certain leeway, but the Honourable Member has been talking about the bill. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Honourable Madam Speaker, you know, I'm not quoting Nickelback tonight so that the Conservatives may not have the cultural references, but I'll quote Bob Marley, if the cap fits, let them wear it. We are talking about how they have used C-11 to spread disinformation, falsehood, paranoia, to make stuff up. The member believes that Canada is going to be turned into North Korea. Who in the world actually thinks back home that Canada is somehow going to be North Korea if we actually make Netflix pay tax? Think about that for a moment. Who actually thinks that Disney is going to be forced to shut down, and that this is all about the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, as the member for Lethbridge said, being able to block your cat videos? Now, I know Conservative backbenchers probably spend a lot of time in the House watching cat videos. I don't know what else they do on the backbench, but I can assure them, nobody's going to touch your cat videos. They're okay. We're just asking Netflix and YouTube to pay their share of tax. Now, that might be the other element that we haven't talked about tonight, Madam Speaker, how the Conservatives are more than willing to allow massively powerful corporations not to pay their fair share. I mean, look at what they do with big oil. There's not a subsidy yet that they don't think that they aren't entitled to. But we're going to get back to the bill itself, Madam Speaker. The bill is about making sure that we have a level playing field. But we also have to address, in this Parliament of Canada, the fact that the idea of using disinformation and fear and paranoia and stoking your base consistently is not a healthy thing. And I've heard again and again about user content. I mean, the Conservatives who hate arts. You know, if you ever been at the airport and your plane's delayed?
For Cumberland Colchester on a point of order.
That is a patent lie. I'll be very clear, Madam Speaker. Why is that? Because that member actually said that I hate the arts. Madam Speaker, my son is now in a program for musical theatre. So how could I possibly hate the arts, Madam Speaker?
Words like that, and the Honourable Member may... the honourable member may bring a point of clarification, but we do not use such words in the House, as the honourable member rightfully knows. And we'll let the honourable member finish his speech. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, we also know it's very unparliamentary to accuse someone of lying, but I was starting to talk about the Conservative leader, so I know why they're jumping in front of the bus to stop me. Yeah. You know, have you ever been in the airport? You ever been in the airport and your plane's delayed? You know, me when I go call my wife or I sit and read a book, but you know, buddy beside you, he gets mad and he starts shouting into his phone. And you're like, oh, buddy, just stop, okay? We're all delayed. That's the Conservative leader. That's what he does. His plane's delayed, he's shouting into his phone, and he's convinced that the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau is going to block his user-generated content to rant about how his plane was delayed. The Conservatives aren't here for arts. They do not believe in arts. I've said that, I'll say that again. If they're calling struggling artists big union bosses and they want to talk about user-generated content, then...
Well, member for Cumberland Colchester in a point of order. Yes.
Perhaps I'll say this in a clearer fashion, Madam Speaker. I have a son who is studying musical theatre. It's very clear. How could I possibly hate the arts, Madam Speaker?
Opportunity to make those facts known. The honourable member will have the opportunity. That is not a point of order. That the honourable member will have the opportunity to make those points and the questions and on the same point of order. Yes, the honourable parliamentary secretary to the government house leader.
What is actually a point of order, Madam Speaker, is that when you rise and somebody's microphone specifically turns off, they're supposed to close their mouth and sit down. This member continues to interrupt you and to continue to challenge your authority. I think that he should put himself in order by respecting the chair.
We're getting a bit warmed up right now, and we are trying to keep an orderly house. And can we allow the honourable member for Timmins James Bay to proceed with his speech? He has less than 1 minute to conclude, and then there are questions and comments that can be made during the 10 minutes following. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm really glad to know that my honourable colleague has a son. I don't know what that had to do with stopping me from talking about the failure of the Conservative leadership to deal with disinformation, falsehoods, paranoia, and conspiracy, because I would think it would be in the interest of all our children. As parliamentarians, we act like adults, but obviously that's not been happening with Bill C-11. So I'm going to be here all week. I'm more than willing. I sit and listen to disinformation and falsehood every day, but I think it's really important that we're clear when we call it out. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the colleague. Now, although he talked a lot about conspiracy theories, the Senate, the place of sober second thought, looked at this bill in detail and brought an amendment, one of which is to try to exclude individual content. They recognize that the CRTC really shouldn't be determining what individuals are posting. And so Clause 4, the extent to which a program contains a sound recording that's been assigned a unique identifier under an international standards system, or the fact that the program's been uploaded to an online undertaking that provides a social media service, or the fact that a program or significant part has been broadcast by a broadcast undertaking or is required to be carried on under a license. This amendment was brought to make sure that those that are doing commercial business are overseen by the CRTC, but that individual content is excluded. And the NDP, in their unholy marriage with the Liberals, have rejected this amendment. Could he explain to the Canadian public why that is?
Honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you. I really want to thank my honourable colleague. I could say Exhibit A, and I could probably just sit down. What's this unholy marriage stuff when it comes to parliamentary work? They cannot do this without disinformation, and I like my honourable colleague, but she was the member who believed that horse tranquilizers was going to help deal with COVID and ran on it, and obviously a falsehood. So let's talk about her what she's saying. I don't see anything in this bill, Madam Speaker, that says that the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau is going to be able to look at your search functions, and the Conservatives believe that. So another one.
I have another point of order for the... Yes, the honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Madam Speaker, this individual on the other side of the floor continues to malign and treat other members in this House with great disrespect.
the honourable member knows that that is a matter for debate, and this goes on all sides. There are no name calling. It's not on parliamentary language. I understand what the honourable member is saying, but it has been a very how shall I put it, lively debate. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I married my wife in the church. I've not been involved in any unholy marriages with any Liberals. You could look that up. Now, I bet there's probably a Reddit page run by the Conservatives who say elsewhere. And so I feel the need to challenge that disinformation and that paranoia, because I bet by tomorrow morning they're going to say that Klaus Schwab looked over the wedding. And it didn't happen. I married my wife.
We are going to go to another question, the honourable member for Hamilton.